get it rolling with the news here. Iowa offensive coordinator Brian Ferentz inked a new deal that includes a pay cut and some designated performance objectives. That's meaning that in order to have it renewed at the end of next season, that his offense has to score at least 25 points per game and produce a minimum of 7 wins. As a reminder, Brian is the son of head coach Kirk Ferentz. I'm sure we have some thoughts here. Carl, we know that's why you're mad. We'll give you the second word here, but first, Brandon, what are your thoughts on all of this?
Oh, man, I got a long list of reasons why Brian should not be employed at Iowa right now, or for that matter, probably ever. If you guys remember, back in 2012, when he was hired at Iowa, they had to skirt a bunch of issues there, mainly the nepotism rules and guidelines at the University of Iowa. They had to announce this hire at first as it being the decision of athletics director Gary Barta, and that Kirk Ferentz was not the one who made the hiring. Of course, within a couple of days, Brian Ferentz contradicted that in a press conference, saying that his dad reached out to him and was immediately interested in the job. This was not Gary Barta making the hire. So Iowa steps back, says we're handling that issue. We feel okay with the way we handled that hiring. Then, of course, even before that, Brian Ferentz played at Iowa for his father. His father, the highest paid public employee in the state of Iowa. His son, Brian Ferentz, though, was living in government-subsidized housing that was meant to be put there for people who could not afford housing. Yet he was living in it. And at the time, Iowa was called out for it by ESPN's Outside the Lines. And then Kirk Ferentz had the audacity to say, well, I just don't give my son a lot of an allowance. He's got to earn things. Well, no, you're not taking any responsibility for that, and you're putting it on the taxpayers to pay for your son to have housing and houses that should be there for low-income families. So another issue there that I have with that family. Also, look at 2020. Racially insensitive comments are made public. And now there is a federal discrimination lawsuit that's going to court in May 2023, and Brian Ferentz is in that fold. And now you look to this, where we're talking about scoring points and how he's got to have 25 points per game. Newsflash, less than 50% of the time he's able to do that. If you look even through Kirk Ferentz's career, only 14 times in 24 years has he averaged more than 25 points per game. That is ridiculous. And now you're looking at Brian Ferentz, who is going to have to score 25 points per game to keep his job. And then also, if he gets to keep his job, he gets a pay bonus and some bonuses on top of that for 2024 and beyond, which is ridiculous. He gets rewarded for having an offense that will probably rank in the 80s nationally for averaging more than 25 points per game. And oh, by the way, don't forget, Iowa has a very easy non-conference schedule. So if they wanted to, they could just pile up the points in those games and be able to skate by and hit that average. How easy is that? Probably pretty easy. Even if you look at the past for Kirk Ferentz and for Brian Ferentz. Ferentz has been calling the offense there for his father since 2017. They only averaged 26.1 points per game against non-conference opponents, but a lot of that is because they just pull the starters out. Well, what's going to keep them from not keeping those starters in there for the rest of the game just so they can pump up those numbers? Because as we've seen, Iowa and Brian Ferentz and Kirk Ferentz are all about protecting and keeping everything solid and secret from the outside. Even if everybody's attacking it and knows it's wrong, they want to treat everybody else like they're stupid and they don't understand what they see. This is absolutely just another step in the wrong direction for that program. And by the way, so much bad just people involved in this when it comes to power and decisions. And as the great physicist Brian Cox once said, when it comes to this offense and the need for change and change within that program, nothing happens and nothing keeps happening forever. Iowa deserves better, and they're going to get better at some point, but they're going to take down this program with the Ferentz family until then.
Carl what?
Brandon, first of all, what does where he lives have to do with his dad? Are you suggesting that his dad is supposed to give him a living allowance, prior to him being in that situation? Kirk Ferentz being the highest paid employee in the state of Iowa has absolutely nothing to do with the amount of money his son was making at the time to get in that, to be able to stay in that housing. Let's deal with this. Let's throw that out.
It has a lot to do with it, actually. Iowa is housing some football players in government housing, in Section 8 housing that should be available to low-income families. Brian Ferentz is not in a low-income family. His father's a millionaire. He doesn't qualify.
He's a grown man. It's not his father's responsibility. He wasn't 15 years old. What are you talking about? He was a recruit on the team.
Let's talk about the contract.
So let's get to this. It's a golden rule in employment that you should always consider. And Kirk Ferentz and Brian Ferentz are on different ends of this. Number one, never hire anybody you can't fire. And number two, never take a job that you can't work. At the end of the day, is he good enough to be the offensive coordinator at Iowa or not? That is the question that has to be answered. But the only person who should be making that decision is Kirk Ferentz, because he is the head football coach at the University of Iowa. Nobody else is the head football coach. So if anybody else feels like he's incapable of making that decision, then you remove him as the coach, and then you put somebody else there. But he has the ability and has earned the right to hire whoever he wants to hire, whether it was his son, whether it's former players. He has several former players on the staff at Iowa. Iowa has been one of the most consistent college football programs in the country over the last 15 to 20 years with Coach Ferentz at the helm. They had a terrible offensive year this year. We all know that they weren't good on offense. And if you want the guy don't want him to be the OC, then just fire the guy. But don't walk him out here like a dead man walking. You got to average 25 points a game. You got all of these other things in here. It takes away from the integrity of the game. You're going to leave starters in to get cheap points at the end. You're going to throw a pass when you want to run the ball out because you're trying to hit all of these benchmarks to save a guy, and it hurts the integrity of the game. The guy is either the OC and you let him coach and you live and you die with it, or you get rid of him. But that should only be one person's decision, and that is Kirk Ferentz. He's earned the right to make that choice.
My issue,
you mentioned the key word there, integrity.
Yeah.
They have no integrity. They've shown this throughout their lives. They always try to cover things up with excuses. They don't take responsibility. Every issue that's ever become public with them has taken the same approach. They look for someone else to blame or someone else to sweep their problems under the rug. In this instance, when it comes to Brian Ferentz, they've always turned to AD Gary Barta, who has said, hey, I'm responsible for hiring him, not the head coach. Hey, I'm the one restructuring this contract. I see this as an issue from the top down at Iowa that is bleeding throughout that program. And I hate to say this. I mean, Iowa has dealt with a very easy schedule throughout its Big Ten tenure there under Kirk Ferentz because they're in the Big Ten West. And yes, there's a lot to be said for them winning the way they do. But starting in 2024, if they get rid of divisions, Iowa is about to be dealing with a much different Big Ten. And by the way, don't be surprised if about that time or a couple of years after, that's when Kirk Ferentz decides to step down and retire. And here's the big issue. Again, they've given so much power to someone who's been there for so long, for 24 years, Kirk Ferentz. His buyout right now is more than $40 million. Iowa cannot afford that right now. Absolutely not. So they're going to have to ride this thing out until he decides to retire himself, and they got to be able to let him do whatever he wants. But the idea that Kirk Ferentz isn't making these decisions, Carl, I think that's ludicrous. He is making these decisions. He's just pushing the responsibility off on the AD and others, saying, well, they're the ones who said it's okay, we can keep them, and I feel confident in their decision-making. No, Kirk's steering that ship. He always has been.
Are we having this conversation about subsidized housing and about what kind of kid his son is if they average 35 points a game, though? Are we having that conversation?
They were having this conversation. Hey, Carl, they were having this conversation in 2005. They've been having this conversation with him on the local level there for 15 plus years with all the weird issues that's been going on with that family since they've been there. But the winning has covered that up and has not made a national story. And so when things like this happen, of course those things get drudged up because this is a pattern of inappropriate behavior as professionals and as quote unquote the most powerful people in that state when it comes to athletics. It's ludicrous.
I mean, it's embarrassing, right? You know, if you're not going to fire the guy, you need to put some sort of incentive. It's kind of weird to do it in this way, but ultimately what is it telling to your fan base and what is it telling to your opponents? It's kind of, you can already buy a 25-7 t-shirt. Like, they're making jokes about the fact that they know the certain thresholds that he's got to meet. So optically, it's kind of an embarrassing situation. And, I do agree with Brandon in that it does seem like Kirk's fingerprints are all over it. It is his son. There is that kind of, we've talked about this before on shows on how difficult it would be to sit down at the dinner table and fire your son. And so I understand the incentive portion of it because the offense has got to get better, right? I mean, it ultimately needs to get better. This is kind of a weird situation, too. This is our team site reporter here, David Eicholt, saying that Kirk Ferentz said himself last week that the goal is not to win 8 games, yet one of his designated performance objectives is a minimum of 7 wins. Also, you know the sport of football, Carl. I mean, it's not just about the offense in terms of wins. How did Iowa end up winning 8 games last year? Well, not because of the offense.
They played great on defense. Sometimes in football, the defense is playing really well and the offense is playing poor. Sometimes the offense plays well. Sometimes you win a game because of special teams. That's why football is the ultimate team game. I'm not for or against Brian Ferentz. The only thing I'm saying is either let the guy coach without all of the nonsense or fire the guy, but get out of the middle of the road.
A lot of nonsense.
Give that $50,000 to defensive coordinator Phil Parker, who's the most underrated defensive coordinator out there. The guy, all he does is deliver top 5, top 10 defenses year after year after year at Iowa. And yes, it is a complimentary game. That's how they play football there. It's all about field position at Iowa. But to set this low threshold, and again, Kirk Ferentz always talking out of both sides of his mouth, as we mentioned, the 8-win and 7-win thing, but also the offense doesn't have to score 25 points per game. The team has to score 25 points per game. So if the defense scores for them, which is common, they scored 6 defensive touchdowns this past season, then that goes to that average point total. So he could keep his job if Phil Parker continues to drag the entire weight of that Iowa football program on his back. It's ridiculous. Again, they're sitting things up to say, trying to explain things away when in fact they're not really doing anything. The bones are weak there. It's all going to come crumbling down. It's going to come down such an incredible fashion. And I feel the people I really feel bad about are the Iowa fans because they deserve so much better. And boy, here in 3 or 4 years, things are going to be so terrible there. That's what I'm saying. It's going to be bad there in a few years.
The only thing that I would say is we've seen programs before, Brandon, when they run a legendary coach out. Iowa has had a lot of success. Tons of guys in the NFL, tons of bowl games. So now when you start talking about Kirk Ferentz is not doing what he's supposed to do and you start trying to push him out of there, it could end up being a long time in the wilderness for the University of Iowa football. Very tough place to win. Kirk Ferentz found the formula. You got to be careful sometimes what you ask for. I think everybody should let the man do his job the way he wants to do it, the way he's been doing it, and back off of him and leave him alone.
We'll certainly see. It's going to be interesting to see what happens there. Brandon, you mentioned it as a low threshold. Yeah, 25 points a game doesn't seem like a lot. They average 17.7 points a game, so that's more than a touchdown that they've got to average this year. So we'll see.